Welcome, everyone. I'm Linear Anderson. I'm the chair of the philosophy department here at Stanford, and it's my great pleasure tonight to introduce R.J. Wallace, who will be giving the Kant Lectures for 2022-23. Made possible by the generosity of the Elisabeth Rankin Crossett Fund, the Kant Lectures are an annual centerpiece of the intellectual life of the Stanford Philosophy Department. Under the name of the greatest philosopher ever to live, just my opinion, every year we invite one of the most important philosophers now working to offer a detailed look into a large-scale project that's at the center of their concerns. The lectures can treat any topic within philosophy. Some of my colleagues who are not Kantians are very keen to emphasize this point to the visiting Kant lecturers. They don't have to talk about Kant. They can talk about anything in philosophy, which some people, starting with Socrates, might think extends to any topic whatsoever, at least any topic that's worth talking about or thinking about. Through their history since the mid-1970s, the Kant lectures have explored work from an especially wide range of thinkers, from John Rawls, Judith Jarvis Thomson, and Alan Gibbard, through W.V. Quine, Donald Davidson, and David Lewis. Some lecturers, like Hilary Putnam, Peter Railton, Michael Friedman, did choose to connect the lectures to Kantian themes in their own work, but others, like Elizabeth Anscombe, Jerry Fodor, Anthony Appia, not so much. This year, we're pleased to present the 42nd Kant Lectures, and it's my great honor to introduce our Kant lecturer, R.J. Wallace. Professor Wallace is Distinguished Professor of Philosophy and the William and Trudy Ausfahl Chair in the Philosophy Department at the University of California at Berkeley. More editorializing, the greatest public university in the world, just needs to be noted, where he's taught since turning down the chance to come to Stanford University permanently in 1999, and we still haven't forgotten. Before Berkeley, he taught at the Humboldt Universität in Berlin, at the University of Pennsylvania, and at Wesleyan University. Jay did his graduate work at Oxford and Princeton, and his work has ranged broadly across ethics. That work has been recognized by a great number of awards and prizes, including election to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a Guggenheim Fellowship, a Humboldt Foundation Research Award, and stints as Phi Beta Kappa Visiting Scholar and the Einstein Visiting Fellow at Berlin for several years together. Jay's work in ethics is both unusually broad, always deep and foundational, and also uncommonly well tied down in probing and insightful ways to the real-life emotional and interpersonal challenges of our moral life with one another. From his earliest work right down to the present, Jay has explored the nature and implications of our moral emotions and how they bear on fundamental questions about how we should live. Reading Jay's work, one never loses sight of the crisply framed rational questions about the basic principles that orient us as moral creatures. He's always got that in view. But one also never loses sight of the emotional complexities and perplexities of real moral life in which we, all of us, are, as Henry James once put it, among the, quote, deeply involved and immersed and more or less bleeding participants. Already in his first book, Responsibility and the Moral Sentiments from 1994, that book reoriented our thinking about moral responsibility by focusing attention on the dynamics of what Strawson had dubbed the reactive emotions. Jay then collected an important group of papers touching on moral psychological topics in Normativity and the Will in 2006, but these were just the stage setting for my favorite part of his work. In The View from Here, 2013, Wallace investigates the fundamentally perspectival side of our moral life, which arises from the fact that our practical agency is always located in definite worldly and temporal nexus, in which our past choices and our present opportunities fundamentally shape the evaluative landscape that we confront. This means that the moral emotions that express our evaluative stance, for example, regret about our life or affirmation of our life, can come wrenching apart from what would be best from an objective point of view. That book provides a deep investigation of the resulting tensions between this essentially perspectival side and the rationally objective aspects of our moral lives. That work then paved the way toward Jay's most recent book, The Moral Nexus, from 2018, in which he defended a thoroughgoingly relational account of morality itself, treating it as a system of essentially relational duties that connect us to one another interpersonally, enmeshing us in a moral world in which we are all vulnerable to one another. And this is the right way to think about morality. This is how it should be done. This week, if I can judge by the titles, we'll hear about the next stages in this ongoing philosophical development. Under the general title, Drawing Moral Lines, Wallace will lead us on an exploration of the moral emotions of resentment, blame, and grievance that traces their complex moral consequences. It will build on his ongoing work about the full and diverse range of our moral interrelations, which has included penetrating reflections on obligation, on promising, on resentment, hypocrisy, love, regret, affirmation, and more. Allow me to close these introductory remarks on a personal note. Jay was one of my graduate teachers, and he turns out to have been one of the most important, even though I was too stupid to see it or understand why at the time. Jay arrived at Penn in 1988 when I was an extremely naive and quite young graduate student, remarkably innocent of any serious exposure to important recent work in his subfields, and more or less determined as a resolute historian to keep it that way. Undaunted by my prejudices and a certain amount of miseducation I had received at the hands of my undergraduate teachers, Jay gently pushed me to deepen my thinking and exposed me to new areas of thought and new tools for making progress. My later work has gravitated more and more into the territory of ethics, or at least toward that territory, and that has required some serious retooling on my part, because I left too many opportunities to get a proper grounding unseized when I was in graduate school. But the retooling I have been able to do was possible at all mainly because of what I learned from Jay. In large part through informal conversations, but also through the extremely formative experience as working as his teaching assistant in Introduction to Ethics. The sweeping historical range of that introduction, coupled with Jay's sensitive and powerful readings of great historical texts, were just the thing needed to speak to me as a historian and to show me that I had been wrong about my predilections. It opened my mind to new possibilities, and those are the ones I was able to pursue later thanks to Jay. It's a gratifying, lucky hit for me to have this chance to thank him publicly now for being a better teacher than I probably deserved. Jay has always been a great teacher, in fact, and I look forward to learning more from him right away, in fact, which is reason enough for me to shut up, pass the mic. Let me just add a few logistical notes before I do. Tonight's lecture will be titled Resentment and Social Friction, Reactive Blame and Its Vicissitudes. And it will be followed by a very brief question period, and I'll come up and moderate the questions for tonight. And then tomorrow night at 5:30, there will be a second lecture on the politics of grievance. And please note that that lecture will be held in a different location, the beautiful Ashman Hall lecture space in the new McMurtry Art and Art History building over in the Arts District. So that's where we'll meet tomorrow night. Then finally, I invite you to join us for a long seminar discussion devoted to the two lectures together, which will take place at 3:30 p.m. on Friday in room 92Q in the Philosophy Department. So please join me now in welcoming Jay Wallace back to Stanford and prepare for some illumination about the moral emotions and the lines that describe our moral life. Jay.
Thank you so much, Lanier, for that embarrassing introduction. I don't know what to say. Yeah, it was touching and means a lot to me. It's great to be here. Thanks for coming. In recent years, I have just been, doing talks the way the youngs do them, just talking through a handout spontaneously. But my colleagues convinced me that for the Stanford lectures, for the Stanford Kant Lectures, I should really, print out my text and read it to you. So I'm going to try to do that and keep it lively. But I haven't done this for a while and a little out of practice. So, if if you just interrupt if you want, and I can just kind of go rogue in the middle of it. But I hope that won't be necessary. All right. So there's a venerable philosophical tradition that associates the reactive attitudes with our practices of interpersonal accountability. In contemporary discussions, the locus classicus for this idea is P.F. Strawson's immensely influential paper, Freedom and Resentment. Strawson situated interpersonal accountability within the participant stance of involvement in human relationships, and he argued that a susceptibility to such reactive attitudes as resentment and indignation was characteristic of the participant stance. To hold someone morally accountable on this approach just is to be disposed to resent them when they wrong you. This core idea has long struck me as deeply plausible, and for better or worse, I continue to find it a promising framework for understanding the nature and conditions of moral responsibility. But the reactive attitudes, above all the core emotions of resentment and indignation, are morally fraught, even if they're also important to our moral practices. They are refinements of anger, and the hazards and harms of this emotional formation are both familiar and important. They figure centrally, for instance, in the otherwise disparate traditions of philosophical reflection that have converged on the conclusion that we should overcome angry sentiments altogether, expunging them from our interpersonal relations. I reject this extreme conclusion, along with the specific accounts of anger that are often put forward in support of them. In support of it. But those of us who follow Strawson in affirming the importance of reactive anger to participation in interpersonal relations need to acknowledge and attempt to understand the aspects of resentment and indignation that can make them corrosive forces in our lives. That will be my aim in these two lectures. In today's talk, I take up the oppositional character of reactive blame, its tendency to introduce frictions into our social relations. The critics of anger often essentialize some of its most problematic expressions, treating it as constitutively connected to desires to harm or denigrate that are objectionable on any sane moral view. But this approach misdiagnoses the oppositional aspect of anger. Reactive attitudes are sources of social friction, not in virtue of the harms or pains they inherently aim to impose on others, but in virtue of other dimensions of them. I'm going to trace their oppositional aspect in particular to our dependence on the attitudes of others and to the specific affective and dispositional profile of angry disapprobation, even when a desire to harm has been sublimated out of it. The interesting thing is that these same dimensions of the reactive attitudes also contribute to the value of practices of accountability that are organized around them. I developed this point by reflecting on the relational content of moral norms, contrasting reactive blame with Scanlon's influential treatment of our reasons for modifying our behavior toward individuals who have impaired their relations to us. If reactive blame functions in the ways I'm going to theorize as an original source of interpersonal frictions, then it is also a potential source of social influence. Our reactive attitudes impose costs on others, and this in turn helps to shape the outcomes in the social world. Furthermore, we have agency over our reactive attitudes, and this can be understood to transform attitudinal influence into something recognizable as social power. This, I shall argue, is what renders our practices of reactive accountability not only interpersonally valuable, but also especially morally fraught. We might wish to exit altogether from relations to others that give us latent attitudinal power over them, but something like this is built into the forms of moral accountability that we also have good reason to affirm. Okay, so that's the overview. I'm at section 1 now, resentment as social friction. You should all have a handout. I assume there are copies somewhere if you don't have one. Anger is commonly taken to have both a target and an occasion. One is paradigmatically angry at someone on account of something they have done. There are, of course, cases in which the structure fades somewhat into indistinctness, as when one's inchoately enraged without being entirely clear what one is angry about or who exactly is the proper target of one's attitude. The attempt to make sense of one's own emotional formation in such cases, however, will characteristically involve efforts to render more distinct these two constitutive elements in the structure of anger. One will attempt to get clear about what exactly has occasioned one's anger and whether there's an individual or collective agent that it makes sense to be angry about for the infraction. Resentment, as a refinement of generic anger, shares these structural features. It has both an occasion and a target. And the question of its intelligibility is to be understood in these terms as the question of whether it really makes sense to be resentful of the target on account of the behavior or attitudes that are the occasion of the attitude. To be a morally accountable agent on the variant of the reactive approach I favor just is to be an agent who's a fit target of attitudes of this kind, both in general and on the particular occasion on which resentment is concretely experienced. Determining whether this is the case requires, as I see things, resolving at least two kinds of issue. There is, first, the question of the capacities of the target agent. Do they possess the powers of moral understanding and self-control that distinguish mature moral persons? And there is second, the question of the putative occasion of resentment. Is this an action that's presumptively problematic from the moral point of view, and that expresses an attitude of disregard or lack of consideration? I'm not going to discuss the first set of issues in this lecture about the powers or capacities that are generically constitutive of accountable moral agency, but I will eventually come back to the second issue concerning the actions and attitudes that are fit occasions of reactive blame. Before getting there, however, I want to discuss the character of resentment in itself as an original source of what I've called social friction. I've elsewhere characterized the reactive attitudes as oppositional states, which come between the subject and the target. This is familiar from the intimate contexts that are probably the primary interpersonal context for ordinary resentment and blame. People who have let their friends or colleagues down or acted with lack of consideration in these relationships are generally very sensitive to whether they are the target of resentment and experience it as an emotional force that comes between them and the subject of the attitude. It's there in the atmosphere between them as something aversive that needs to be dealt with. But what is it about reactive attitudes that accounts for this oppositional dimension of them? The critics of anger have a ready answer to this question. They ascribe to the subject of anger as an essential element in its attitudinal profile a desire to visit harm on the target person, either as payback for some harm that was visited on the target, or as a mechanism for passing the subject's pain onto some other individual. But if this is what anger is essentially like, it's clear why it should be experienced as a source of social friction. We're strongly averse to being harmed, after all, and don't wish to be in social relations to others that are characterized by the desire that harms or pains should be visited on us. Attractive as this approach might seem, however, I don't think it can be accepted. Anger does, of course, sometimes lead people to lash out with the aim of harming the target individual. Both the desire for payback and the impulse to pass one's pain onto another subject are lamentably familiar symptoms of anger. But they're not essential to the emotion. In the intimate context to which I referred earlier, it seems to me that anger is both common and seldom characterized by overt aggression or hostility. You might be resentful that your friend failed to stand up for you when others were impugning your reputation or integrity at the recent party. But you're unlikely to wish that harm should be visited on your friend as a result, or want to pass your pain onto them. Overt desires of this kind might belong to the profile of some primitive or form of anger from which the reactive attitudes are descended, but the refinement of primitive anger into reactive blame generally involves the sublimation of aggression or hostility into something that's better domesticated and hence suitable to an ongoing relationship of love and attachment and respect. And yet, even these refined forms of reactive blame retain their oppositional character. How might we make sense of this? Whatever else it is, anger is an attitude of disapproval. The subject of reactive anger views the target negatively, thinking of them as having failed or fallen short relative to a standard that the subject thinks important. But as part of our inherently social nature that we care about attitudes of negative assessment of this kind. We're vulnerable to the views that others take towards us and don't wish to be held in disesteem by members of the social worlds we inhabit. This is the flip side of the phenomenon of recognition, our dependence on positive attitudes of regard and consideration and esteem. It falls out of this observation, however, that anger will tend to be experienced as aversive just insofar as and just because it's a form of disapprobation. It introduces frictions into our social relations, not in virtue of the harms that we fear the angry subject will be disposed to inflict on us, but on account of our inherent concern not to be thought poorly of by others. Call this the sociability hypothesis. One might react to this suggestion by pointing out that if you have offended against important moral standards, you have no entitlement against others that they shouldn't hold negative attitudes towards you. This observation seems correct to me, and I don't wish to dispute it. But even if you don't have a claim against others that they should not respond with anger to your moral offense, you might still care about the negative attitudes that others take to you, and therefore wish that you were not exposed to them. You have an interest in it being the case that you're not the target of angry disapprobation, and your own life will seem to go less well to the extent you're on the receiving end of reactive blame. It's consistent with this point that it might be your own responsibility, ultimately, to protect yourself from negative attitudes of this kind, insofar as it's in your power to avoid the moral infractions that attract them in the first place. Furthermore, if you have in fact wronged someone, it might, for all I have said, be better on balance for you to be subject to reactive blame than not to be held to account at all. Still, when you are on the receiving end of the reactive attitudes, you will experience your social situation as dysphoric, which is something you have at least pro tanto reason to regret. The sociability hypothesis, as I've presented it so far, rests on our vulnerability to emotionally inflected disesteem. The psychological tendencies on which it rests, I take it, are fairly widespread in human populations, but I should admit that they're not completely universal. There are unusual individuals who may be indifferent to the negative emotional attitudes that others take towards them, inured to them by resources of ego or privilege. A certain kind of narcissist, for instance, might care primarily about whether they are at the center of the social narrative and regard anger as just one particularly vigorous form of attention that might be bestowed upon their person. I'll leave it to you to guess whom I'm thinking about in this connection. Let them get all riled up, the narcissist might think. At least they're talking about me. Individuals of this kind are certainly conceivable, but they're the exception that proves the rule. The fact is that the vast majority of us wouldn't view attention as a social good in itself, regardless of how it's valenced, but are made extremely uncomfortable when we're the objects of angry scorn and derision. It's a reflection of this that the kind of narcissism I've been describing is generally thought to be a personality disorder. An individual who's not averse to being the object of negative social attention isn't a well-adjusted member of a functioning moral community. The sociability hypothesis, as it seems to me, goes some way toward explaining why we find it uncomfortable to be the targets of reactive anger. Having said that, however, it should also be noted that the hypothesis doesn't appear to distinguish anger from other emotionally tinged forms of negative assessment. As far as it is concerned, we should care equally about anger and about other negative emotional reactions toward our own comportment, such as sorrow or sadness or disappointment, or even simple disapproval. Yet anger and its reactive variants seem more strongly oppositional in their social tendencies than these other forms of disapprobation. How might we explain what distinguishes them in this way within the broader class of negative assessments to which we're inherently averse? The most significant dimension of reactive blame that bears on this question is its dispositional profile. Earlier, I rejected the suggestion that an overt desire that the target should suffer harm is built into reactive anger, suggesting that these tendencies might undergo sublimation in someone who's well brought up. Even in its more domesticated forms, however, anger is a state that is associated with characteristic behavioral dispositions. The residual action tendency of anger, I submit, is a disposition to stand up to the target agent on account of the action of theirs that occasioned the emotion. You're not merely sorrowful or sad about what the agent did, something that you might experience in a comparatively detached and passive state of mind. You're exercised about the infraction in a way that expresses the attitude that it's not okay. And this orientation goes together with a willingness to confront the agent about it in the spirit of insisting that it be dealt with. In earlier work on the reactive attitudes, I suggested that there's a way of demanding that others comply with moral requirements that's constituted by a susceptibility to such emotions as resentment and indignation. In this, I was developing Strawson's observation about emotions of this kind when he wrote that, quote, "The making of the demand is the proneness to such attitudes." It seemed to me, as I think it seemed to Strawson, that holding other people to expectations or demands intuitively expresses itself in a disposition to the paradigm reactive emotions when the demands are flouted. But we can add depth to this observation by connecting it to the point I just made about the dispositional profile of reactive anger. The behavioral tendency to stand up to or to confront the agent about an infraction that is characteristic of anger is also recognizable as a basic way of demanding something from them. Its social function is to make the infraction salient interpersonally as a form of conduct that was not acceptable and that now requires attention. If this is right, then I think we have further insight into the oppositional nature of reactive blame. Anger is aversive insofar as we are vulnerable to the negative attitudes of others toward us and care when they are exercised and upset at what we have done. But it's also aversive in virtue of the behavioral tendencies that make it recognizable as an emotional way of demanding compliance with basic moral requirements. These action tendencies function in part to intensify the discomfort that's built into being the target of emotional disapprobation by making it difficult for the targeted individual to deny or ignore the urgent disapprobation that is directed at them. But these actions are also aversive in their own right. We're generally rendered uncomfortable or disoriented when others confront or stand up to us, addressing demands directly to us in these ways. Indeed, the discomfort people feel when demands are addressed to them can inhibit others from taking this step in the first place. The confrontational action tendencies of reactive anger work to overcome these natural inhibitions. We might speculate that the sublimated aggression characteristic of domesticated anger finds expression in a willingness to tolerate the discomfort that is induced in others when we stand up to them on account of their treatment of us. In these ways, the reactive attitudes work to impede the normal flow of social relations, making them original sources of interpersonal friction. They are like other forms of emotional disapproval, such as sorrow or disappointment, in that they're forms of negative assessment that we generally hope to avoid. But they differ from such emotions in their affective urgency and in their distinctively confrontational action tendencies, which persist even when an overt disposition to aggression is no longer part of their attitudinal profile. As a result of this combination of features, they have a kind of social weight and tend to come between the subject and the individual at whom they're targeted. Okay, that's the end of section 1. On the handout, this is bringing me to section 2 on resentment and relationships. In the preceding section, I said that reactive anger is connected with a familiar way of holding people to normative demands. But what is the nature of these demands? With the central reactive emotions of resentment and indignation, the infractions that occasion them should be understood to involve distinctively relational requirements. I'm just asserting this here, but I just wrote a book about it, so there's some semi-arguments in the book that I'll be drawing on here. These are directed obligations that are owed by one party specifically to another individual or individuals that correspond to claims against the agent on the part of the individuals to whom they are owed, and that give rise to wrongs when they are flouted. I've elsewhere argued that the domain of interpersonal morality in its entirety should be taken to consist of relational requirements of this kind. It involves duties that we owe to other individuals who stand to be affected by our agency and that reflect the equal significance of the interest we each have in how our own lives should go. But relational requirements of this kind are the substance of resentment and indignation. Thus, the constitutive of thought of resentment is generally taken to be along the lines of, I've been wronged. And this is a thought about the flouting of a distinctively relational or directed requirement. Granted, there are directed requirements that we owe to others in virtue of the special relationships that we stand in to them as friends, siblings, colleagues, teachers, and so on. And resentment is familiar in these contexts when such requirements are violated. But if morality is the domain of egalitarian relational requirements that are in place even outside of such special ties, then it's not surprising that resentment should be the paradigmatic emotional reaction to specifically moral infractions. The ability to explain the normative significance of moral standards for relations of interpersonal accountability of this kind is, in fact, one of the philosophical advantages of the relational approach to them. The assumption here is that moral standards are distinguished in part through the role they play in structuring accountability relations between people. They are the kind of standards that it makes sense to demand that agents should comply with, and the disregard of those standards gives other parties reasons for the reactive attitudes characteristic of blame. Interestingly, there's an intentional component to these reasons, as Strawson himself pointed out long ago. What renders reactive blame warranted is not simply the failure to comply with moral demands, but the negative quality of will generally expressed in such failures. What matters specifically are attitudes that involve a lack of consideration or regard for the interests of individuals who might be affected by the subject's actions. But these elements in our understanding of the nature of moral standards start to fall into place when we interpret those standards in relational terms. According to the relational account, moral standards define obligations that are owed to other individual claim holders, so a lack of regard for those standards amounts to an attitude of disregard for the claims of some individual or individuals, which is a clear recognitional failure. Furthermore, the recognitional failure at issue constitutively involves a wrong that is done by the agent to the claim holders. But as I noted earlier, it is wrongs of this kind that are understood to provide warrant for resentment on the claim holder's part. The normative significance of moral standards for other parties thus makes good sense when we interpret those standards to specify relational requirements that agents owe to other parties. A further consequence of this approach, however, is that the relation defined by the moral nexus of agent and claim holder is, as we might put it, the primal scene for the practice of interpersonal accountability. Individuals are pictured as demanding that agents comply with their own moral claims, and when they're wronged, it is they in particular who have reasons for resenting the wrongdoer. There's a conception of dignity that that it is implicit in this interpretation of morality, insofar as individuals are taken to be entitled to assert moral claims on their own behalf against agents, which is a way of standing up for oneself. I shall come back to this theme in the next lecture. In the meantime, however, it should be noted that the approach doesn't preclude third-party accountability relations. We do, of course, often blame agents for wrongs that are done not to us, but to other individuals. This is the familiar territory of indignation, which is one of the central reactive attitudes. The relational approach acknowledges the possibility of third-party blame of this kind, but it understands it to be an inherently vicarious phenomenon, to use Strawson's own expression for these cases. The subject of indignation is exercised about wrongful behavior on behalf of the individuals who are directly wronged by it, where this amounts to asserting claims on their behalf. This, too, is a theme to which I'm going to return. The upshot of these remarks is that accountability relations have a relational deep structure, which reflects the character of the moral norms that they are based on. I would now like to bring this idea to bear on the assessment of the value of reactive blame as a distinctive way of responding to conduct that expresses a disrespectful quality of will. To set the stage, it will be helpful to begin with an influential proposal for understanding blame due to Tim Scanlon, which is one of the most important recent contributions to philosophical discussion of this issue. Scanlon takes as his starting point an idea that's broadly congenial to the relational approach I've been sketching, which is that blame is characteristically a response to actions that, in virtue of their meaning, impair the relations the agent stands in to other parties. Here is Scanlon's own central example, and I'm going to quote a few lines from his book, Moral Dimensions. Quote, "Suppose I learn that at a party last week, some acquaintances were talking about me and making some cruel jokes at my expense. I further learn that my close friend Joe was at the party, and that rather than coming to my defense or adopting a stony silence, he was laughing heartily and even contributed a few barbs, revealing some embarrassing facts about me that I had told him in confidence. This raises a question about my relationship with Joe. Should I still consider Joe to be my friend?" End quote. As Scanlon develops this example, to judge that Joe is blameworthy is to return a negative answer to the question of whether Joe is still Scanlon's friend, taking Joe's attitudes to have impaired the relationship he stands in to Scanlon. The impairment of a relationship of this kind, furthermore, has normative significance for the parties to the relationship, giving Scanlon in particular reasons to modify his own attitudes toward Joe. Quote, "I might, for example, cease to value spending time with Joe in the way one does with a friend, and I might revise my intentions to confide in him and to encourage him to confide in me." End quote. To revise your attitudes in these ways in response to the actions of others that impair their relationships to you just is to blame them for those actions, according to Scanlon's account. As I mentioned, Scanlon's suggestion that it's the impairment of relationships that is the occasion of blame is broadly congenial with the relational account of the content of moral norms that I sketched earlier, though the point requires careful handling. Talk of impairment might suggest that there's an ongoing socially significant relationship of some kind between the wrongdoer and another party, which is damaged by the attitudes expressed in the wrongful conduct. But this structure isn't present in all cases. You might suffer deliberate or negligent harm at the hands of someone you are encountering for the very first time, and that should equally be a situation that gives you warrant for blame. The relational approach makes sense of this by interpreting the notion of a relationship that is material to blame in normative terms. Relationships in the relevant sense are defined by sets of directed obligations and the claims that correspond to them on the side of those to whom they are owed. These obligations cannot, of course, themselves be impaired by the agents who are subject to them, but there is a valuable way of relating to people that is constituted by the conscientious concern to comply with them. And it's a significant relational failing, an impairment relative to this value to disregard them. As noted earlier, some obligations of this kind are based in ongoing relationships of attachment, such as the obligation that Joe owes to Scanlon as his friend to stick up for him at the party and to be discreet with information that was shared with him in confidence. Joe impairs his ongoing relationship to Scanlon by showing disregard for these requirements of friendship, which is also a way of showing a lack of regard for Scanlon as a friend. But relational requirements can also be in place in cases in which there's no ongoing relationship of attachment. You have claims against other members of the moral community that they show due concern for your vulnerability to harm, and a person might betray a lack of consideration for this claim in their very first interaction with you. This is the kind of impairment that matters to questions of blame, a falling short of the level and kind of regard that agents owe to other parties, whether friends or strangers, who might be affected by what they do. Scanlon's central claim is that relational shortcomings of this kind have normative significance for the parties affected by them, and that blame should be understood as the reasoned adjustment of the parties' attitudes in response to the apprehension of this normative significance. In his own controlling example, the general tendency of these adjustments is in the direction of what Albert O. Hirschman described as exit. Scanlon says that he might cease to value spending time with Joe and revise his intentions to share things in confidence with him, which is tantamount to partial or total withdrawal from a genuine relationship of friendship with Joe. Granted, Scanlon allows that elements of Hirschman-style voice might also play a role in cases in which a relationship has been impaired. But he does not seem to regard them as central or necessarily important. One's responses to the impairment, here I quote Scanlon again, quote, may include intentions to complain to the person and to demand an explanation, justification, or apology, end quote, depending on whether they are special features of the case that there are special features of the case that make these reactions appropriate. Thus, quote, self-respect may require that I speak up for myself rather than merely walking away from our relationship in silence, end quote. But it's the walking away that is of the essence of blame, not the complaint or the protest. It is on this point that I see a significant contrast between Scanlon's approach and the reactive accountability and blame that I, following Strawson, have favored. Scanlon's theory of blame as exit describes a set of reactions to relational failures that hang together coherently as an intelligible syndrome that bypasses traditional concerns about freedom as a condition of responsibility. What matters to blame is not that a wrongdoer acted freely, but that the intentional quality of their behavior affected their relationship to another party in ways that give that party reasons to withdraw from or to modify the relationship. One might worry that the resulting account is too emotionally anodyne to capture the phenomenon that we intuitively experience as moral blame. And some of us have expressed doubts along these lines in print. But I'm not certain how strongly moved Scanlon should be by this objection. One can read him as troubled by the hostile connotations of reactive anger and concerned to present an alternative account of blame that relegates the emotional element to a peripheral role. But the question is whether, in doing this, he's sacrificing features of ordinary blame that contribute to its value as an interpersonal phenomenon. Blame as exit, as I have explained, takes partial or total withdrawal from relationships to be the paradigmatic tendency of blame. But we need a way of responding to moral infractions that affirms the continuing importance of the relationship between the parties affected by it. My contention is that reactive blame is well suited to this role precisely in virtue of the features of it that I highlighted in the first section. To see this, it will help to make explicit some distinctions that are merely implicit in the preceding discussion. We started with the idea of a relational harm, which is constituted by the attitude of disregard for the directed requirements that define what one party owes to another. This relational harm occurs in the larger context of a relationship between the parties. In Scanlon's controlling example, this is the relationship of friendship between Scanlon and Joe, which Scanlon withdraws from in response to the impairment. Finally, there are continuing interactions between the parties, which will be shaped by their understanding of the nature of the relationship that they stand in to each other. Scanlon and Joe might have to interact with each other whatever happens. Maybe they are colleagues. But it will matter to the character of these interactions whether they understand themselves to be friends or have ceased relating to each other in that way. The point in these terms is that exit from the larger relationship within which impairment happens isn't the only option. Sometimes we can't fully exit from such relationships. This may be the case with the generic moral relationship, which is defined not by any thick pattern of historical ties, but simply by the directed obligations that we owe to those whose interests might be affected by our agency. To withdraw from this relationship would be to cease caring about complying with basic moral expectations, which is not something that it is so much as permissible for us to do. But even where exit might be a permissible option, it's often one that we would prefer not to resort to. We may continue to care about the larger character of the relationship within which the infraction originally occurred, and we need a way of responding to it that reflects this orientation of ongoing commitment. That is where reactive blame comes in. As we saw in the preceding section, reactive attitudes introduce frictions into our interactions with people that don't depend on the questionable assumption that their subject desires the target to suffer harm. This is in part a matter of our innate sociability and our vulnerability to negative attitudes of assessment on the parts of others, but it's also due to the inherent action tendencies of reactive anger, which dispose the subject to confront or to stand up to the person at whom it's targeted. This syndrome of responses, I now want to argue, is appropriate to an ongoing relationship that has suffered harm at the hands of one of the parties and that now needs to be impaired. There are several respects in which the reactive attitudes may be understood to express commitment to your ongoing relationship with the person who is their target. They're emotional reactions, for one thing, that are characteristic of the more general phenomenon of valuing, which is commonly and plausibly understood to constitutively involve an element of emotional investment. To value something is not just to believe that it has value, but to care about the relevant value in the way that disposes you to negative emotions when the object of value is harmed or damaged. Someone who's resentful or indignant is emotionally exercised about the infraction that is the occasion for these attitudes, which is a sign that it matters to them how things stand with something that they value. Insofar as these infractions are understood in the relational terms I proposed, the object of value to which they are connected is the value of recognition or consideration, which is itself constituted by an attitude of conscientiousness toward directed requirements and the claims that correspond to them. You care about whether the target agent acknowledges your claims against them in an ongoing way, and as a result, you become resentful when you realize that they have disregarded or ignored them. This stance of continued valuing contrasts with the exit syndrome that Scanlon associates with blame, which allows that ceasing to value spending time with Joe might be a paradigmatic expression of blame. As we have seen, the emotional investment characteristic of reactive blame has a distinctive affect and action profile, which sets it apart from other forms of valuing. But its distinguishing features further contribute to its significance in the context of an ongoing relationship between individuals who continue to care about the requirements that link them to each other. Angry disapprobation tends to focus the attention of the parties on the relational failing that occasions it. It matters to the subject that they were wronged by the target, and its mattering disposes the subject to confront or stand up to the target about the issue, protesting the conduct and giving voice to their complaint. A syndrome of responses with this profile, I believe, potentially contributes in three ways to the maintenance of ongoing relationships between individuals. First, it helps to render the relational norms that link them to each other interpersonally legible as genuine requirements. It's not okay for the parties to disregard these relational norms, and its being not okay is made perspicuous through the reactions of angry disregard that their flouting attracts. Second, in virtue of the friction that the reactive anger introduces into the ongoing relationship, it functions to impede the normal interactions that are characteristic of the relationship, placing the infraction that occasioned it on the agenda of the parties as something that needs to be dealt with before they can proceed. Third, within the context of an ongoing relationship, this in turn calls for a familiar suite of responses on the part of the target of resentment, including acknowledgement, remorse, apology, and the making of amends. Reactive blame thus reflects the subject's continued investment in a relationship that's defined by directed requirements and claims, and its characteristic expressions are appropriate to this relational context. It makes sense to respond to wrongful conduct in this way if you take your ongoing relationship with the agent to be important, and if you care about the terms on which it is conducted. Much of the value and significance of blame derive from these interpersonal dimensions of it, but they become dispensable if we follow Scanlon in thinking that withdrawal and exit are paradigmatic cases of blame. Okay, that's the second section, and that brings me to section 3, from influence to power. The reactive attitudes have been characterized by Gary Watson as, quote, incipiently forms of communication. This is a suggestive, but also a somewhat elusive idea. What is it about the reactive attitudes that renders them incipiently communicative? There are some generic ways in which all emotions might be suited to communication. They have objects that can be represented linguistically, and we can also communicate the fact that we are subject to them. But reactive emotions seem to be incipiently communicative in a different and much more interesting sense. As we've seen, they dispose the subject to actions that involve confronting or standing up to the target individual about the behaviors that occasioned them. The characteristic expressions of these tendencies are, as Hirschman might put it, acts that give voice to the subject's complaint about the target and that are directed specifically to the target, i.e., they are performances with a communicative nature and aim. Reactive attitudes are incipiently forms of communication, then, not just because they involve states or contents that can be communicated to others, but because the behavioral tendencies bound up with them are tendencies to engage in inherently communicative acts. This dovetails with a suggestion that's recently been made by Miranda Fricker, who sees communicative blame, as she calls it, as the paradigm by reference to which we should understand the more general phenomenon of moral blame. Fricker herself doesn't interpret blame essentially in terms of the reactive attitudes. But if we do so, then there's one important sense in which communication is the paradigmatic form of blame. Blame might not always be communicated to the target in fact, but the reactive attitudes in which blame consists involve tendencies to confront and stand up to the target making it, as we have seen, dispositionally communicative. Communication might also be taken to be normatively paradigmatic for reactive blame, insofar as a communicative exchange between the subject and the target is the primary context in which reactive blame has a valuable role to play. Reactive attitudes manifest the subject's investment in an ongoing relationship that's organized around directed requirements and claims, and they function within that context to render those requirements legible and to put the subject's disregard of them on the agenda to be dealt with. A communicative intervention of this kind invites, as I noted above, characteristic responses on the part of the target of resentment, including remorseful acknowledgement, apology, compensation for harms caused by the disrespectful act, and so on. But how should we conceptualize these ways of resolving the communicative exchange? Fricker suggests that the constructive goal of such an exchange is to effect alignment in moral understanding between the subject and the target of communicative blame. This is no doubt part of the story, though it cannot be the entire goal, since communicative blame might lead to alignment on a false narrative about the target agent's comportment. Consider a case in which reactive blame is used manipulatively to guilt trip the target into conceding wrongdoing when their attitude toward the subject was in fact beyond reproach. A more conventional characterization of the constructive outcome would be in terms of repair, and this does seem appropriate to the relational context that frames the interaction between the subject and the target in the first place. In the standard case, reactive blame is occasioned by lack of consideration for the relational requirements that are owed by the target agent to the other subject, which is tantamount to a failure of recognition. Insofar as that failure damages the relationship between the parties, the harm cannot exactly be undone, and repair cannot be understood as a matter of rewriting history. I may be disagreeing with Hegel on this point, but I'm not sure. I'm happy to be disagreeing with Hegel on this point if that's what I'm doing. But anyway. But the next best thing is a process that makes it possible for the parties who care about their ongoing relations to resume interactions with each other on normal terms. This is the right way to understand our conventional rituals of repair, which involve alignment in understanding on the truth about the relational failure, together with expressions of apology and attempts to make amends on the part of the wrongdoer. These responses to communicative blame at least pave the way toward a resumption of the normal interactions that blame has functioned to impede, opening the possibility of continued relations that are based on a shared commitment to the importance of the relational norms that linked the parties to each other. Whether they are in fact able to move forward in this way finally depends on whether the subject is able to forgive the target of reactive blame, something that of course is not always possible. But the constructive function of reactive blame situates it within the unfolding communicative process that it sets in motion, the protagonists of which are the individuals whose relations to each other were immediately affected by the original moral infraction. On this point, there's a further illuminating contrast with Scanlon's conception of blame as exit. Adjustment of attitudes in the direction of withdrawal from an impaired relationship is an expression of defeat rather than a step on the way to repair. It does not preclude later restoration of relations between the parties, but there's nothing in the dynamic of blame that, as exit, that disposes the subject to initiate a process of repair. Reactive blame is different in precisely this respect, involving tendencies to confront and to stand up to the target individual, protesting their conduct and giving voice to the subject's grievance. Acts of this kind, as we've seen, are paradigmatically communicative, initiating an exchange whose natural trajectory is renewed commitment to the importance of the requirements that have been flouted and resumption of relations on their basis. The conversations that are typically initiated by reactive blame have a distinctive character. Their starting point is a communicative performance in which the subject of resentment stands up to the target, giving voice to a complaint and protesting the way they have been treated. This is a confrontational mode of interaction of a kind that I've characterized as inherently aversive. And this very quality is partly what makes it potentially effective in the context of a relationship that's been damaged through the attitudes of one of the parties toward the other. There's an edge to the communicative actions that give expression to reactive blame, which is connected to the distinctive emotional affect of angry disapprobation. Interpersonal demands that are addressed through these kinds of emotions are difficult to dismiss or ignore. The subject of resentment is clearly exercised about what has happened in a way that will inhibit normal relations until the grievance that is being expressed has been acknowledged and dealt with by the parties. In virtue of these features of it, reactive blame functions as a kind of attitudinal pressure within the interpersonal context in which it's normally experienced. Its aversive character operates to incentivize certain behaviors on the part of the target, paradigmatically including those communicative behaviors that are oriented toward repair. The target's more likely to engage in such behaviors precisely because they are ways of potentially escaping the social frictions created by reactive blame. The influence we have over each other on account of these dynamic processes is, of course, not irresistible, and I shall address in the next lecture some of the strategies that may be adopted to defend against the attitudinal pressures that are mobilized in reactive blame. But the pressures are definitely there, and they constitute an informal system for drawing lines in our social relations and nudging people back onto the right side of them when they have been breached. Reactive blame may be experienced as social pressure even when it's not directly communicated or otherwise expressed. As I noted in the first section, we're generally discomfited to know that we are the targets of angry disapprobation, and that's enough to incentivize some of the responses characteristic of acknowledgement and repair. But these attitudinal pressures are intensified through their interpersonal expression. The urgent addressing of demands by the subject of reactive anger ups the ante in the ways I've been describing, introducing frictions into the relationship between the parties that need to be dealt with somehow. But where influence interacts with agency, the result is a kind of social power. In the case at issue, we can conceptualize the relevant power as a form of power over other individuals, construed as a capacity to effect changes in their attitudes and behavior. To have this kind of social power is not necessarily to be in a position to determine definitively how another person will feel or think or react. People are too unpredictable to enable others to stand in this kind of relationship to them. What suffices for social power is that one can act in ways that help to bring about changes in the attitudes and behavior of another, increasing the likelihood that those changes will occur. And that's typically the way social power is theorized by political philosophers. The communicative actions characteristic of reactive blame, on account of their oppositional nature, amount to exercises of social power in this perfectly familiar sense. Now, most of these communicative performances are fairly spontaneous. They address moral demands to others with an immediacy that is typical for the expression of urgent emotional states. But there's a further agential dimension of the reactive attitudes that bears on their status as sources of social power. This is our capacity to intensify or attenuate the effects of our reactive attitudes on others through our efforts to manage those states. Thus, it's open to us to treat our resentment of another as interpersonally significant, acceding to it and affirming it as something that has come between us and now needs to be dealt with. Alternatively, we can take steps to overcome our resentment, putting it to the side to the extent it persists, and treating it as something to be dismissed or ignored. These managerial stances are not expressions of the reactive attitudes, but intentions that are taken in response to them. Forgiveness, as I understand it, operates within the space of possibilities that is opened up by our capacities for this kind of managerial control of our reactive emotions. The language we use to describe forgiveness is fundamentally agential in character. We offer someone forgiveness, for instance, in a process that's often characterized in terms of the forswearing of resentment. Furthermore, the reasons to which forgiveness is responsive are typically reasons for action, by contrast with the considerations that provide warrant for resentment in the first place. Thus, it's a familiar point, and one I have endorsed in this discussion, that reasons for the reactive attitudes are provided in the first instance by facts about the flouting of relational moral requirements. It's fitting for you to resent someone if they've wronged you, for instance. A further familiar point is that these reasons for resentment, being historical in nature, are not literally altered or undermined by the actions that come after them. The wrongdoer may apologize to the victim, express remorse, offer to make amends, and so on, in the ways we have seen to contribute to the repair of the relational damage that was done by the original infraction. But none of these things changes the fact that the victim was, in fact, wronged. If reasons for resentment persist in this way, however, the question arises as to how forgiveness is so much as possible. My own response to this puzzle is that forgiveness is, in the first instance, an exercise of our capacity to manage our emotional states, and that we can have good reason to act in the ways characteristic of forgiveness, even if there's still some warrant for the reactive emotions that forgiveness works to overcome. In the paradigm case I've come back to repeatedly in this lecture, a response of remorseful acknowledgement and apology and restitution on the part of the wrongdoer might restore the possibility of normal, respectful relations between the parties, in which case the continued inhibition of them through angry confrontation no longer really has a point. Under these conditions, there can be very good reason for the victim to forswear their resentment and to treat it as interpersonally insignificant, even if the emotion would continue to make sense on account of the historical wrong. If we can manage reactive blame in the direction of attenuation and overcoming, we can also manage it in the direction of intensification. We can, and sometimes do, cultivate attitudes of angry disapprobation, clinging to them and insisting on their interpersonal significance. And we do these things for both good reasons and bad. The important point for present purposes is that these managerial actions can be thought of as exercises of the latent power we have over other people in virtue of our susceptibility to states that are oppositional in the ways I have been discussing. Reactive attitudes introduce frictions into our relations with others, and we can make use of the resulting pressures managerially in ways that help to bring it about that the targets of them modify their own attitudes and behavior in accordance with our preferences. One might understandably recoil from this aspect of reactive blame. It's a morally fraught thing to stand in relations of power over other individuals, and this might tempt us to try to ditch the reactive attitudes altogether, substituting the element of voice they enable in favor of the more neutral exit strategies that Scanlon so skillfully outlines. But I think it's a fantasy to believe that we can escape from the basic predicament of having power over others through the attitudes that we adopt towards them. Some element of this is simply endemic, given to us, as Strawson might put it, with the fact of our social life. The challenge is to acknowledge this aspect of our relations to each other and to navigate responsibly the morally hazardous shoals that we operate in as a result of it. And I'll come back to the question of how to do that in tomorrow's lecture. So thank you very much.
we have time for a couple of questions. Student questions first.
Yeah, thanks. So I was struck in one sense by some of your phrasing of the kind of ongoing relationship or relations in which reactive blame found its home, and what seemed to me the thinness of the kind of communicative context in which a lot of these communicative dispositions and acts might rear their heads. So I was curious if you could maybe respond to a case to help illuminate how you're thinking about how thin those relations can be. So I was thinking about texting on a subway, and you look over, you see a stranger reading perhaps intimate, perhaps otherwise kinds of texts, and you naturally react in a seeming instance of this kind of reactive blame. You're upset, you call them to account, but you do so in a particularly different kind of way, at least in some kinds of circumstances. I care less about whether the sort of peeping Tom was going to apologize to me. In fact, I know they're getting off at the next stop. There's not going to be an ongoing relationship here. What I'm doing here is perhaps exerting my social power in an importantly different dimension, giving rise to everybody else to sort of attend to what's going on here, to attend to this individual and so on. Is that kind of case one you think is a sort of central instance of this kind of reactive blame? Is it degenerate? If so, could you say a little bit more about the kind of relationship or relations we're engaged in the broader social context, just so I can understand it? Thanks.
Good. Yeah, that's helpful and interesting. I'm not sure I got the example. It seemed like it started out someone's looking at offensive texts on their phone.
Someone's just invading your privacy.
Oh, they're invading your privacy.
It's your privacy. You're texting your wife, say, and they're reading over your shoulder.
They're reading over your shoulder. I see. Yeah. Okay, I got it. I thought they turned into a, someone who's exposing themselves in the course of the exam. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think you're right. The reaction might have a kind of signal function within the larger community, signaling that, this person, look out for this person. And that might have a communicative function, not just in relation to the person who's committed the original infraction, but to other people who might be sitting in the subway, especially if you're about to get off. But it still seems to me the primary context, that's what I'm thinking. I mean, the primary context is the relation between you and the person who's invading your privacy. They have, they've invited your privacy, after all. And I think it would be perfectly natural to respond, in a way that expresses that you're taken aback. And, dude, I don't know how you'd say this in the subway. That's not okay. You just need to say dude with the right tone of voice. And you've communicated everything. You've communicated that there's like a line here. It's not okay to cross this line. I think that's how it's, a lot depends on the nature of this person sitting next to you on the subway, of course. But in a healthy context, that will provoke the response, sorry, I shouldn't have done that, or that wasn't okay. I still see that as the primary context. It would be reassuring, at least, even if you're about to get off at the next stop, to hear from the other person that they have some remorse for what you've done. And I think that would be the primary thing that's certainly the primary thing that's on your mind. And as I'm seeing it, that's the kind of primary function that is performed by the kind of reactive blame I'm discussing here. But it's consistent with that it might perform a secondary signaling function. There are other signaling functions that it might also subserve. A friend and Stanford alumnus, Manuel Vargas, has defended a really interesting view recently of blame as of costly signaling, where what you're signaling, you're not warning other people in the train that this guy, you should get into, move to the next car, so much as signaling to other members of the moral community a certain level of your own investment in the moral community. And I think that's an interesting suggestion, but it doesn't seem to me to be the primary function of blame, because it makes the blame too much about yourself rather than the target of the attitude in the first place. But thanks. I hope that helps.
Okay, this worked.
Hey, Michael, great to see you.
Yeah, this is great.
Yeah,
That's been a while.
it's been too long. Yeah, I saw this very insistent student when you asked for student questions. Yeah.
It's been a long time.
Yeah.
Anyway,
One is always a student of
here's what
philosophy.
I'm wondering about. I don't hear much talk about the affective dimension of anger.
About what?
affective dimension.
Oh, affective,
What it
yeah.
Affective,
Yeah.
okay. The feelings that go along with anger.
Yeah.
So I'm worried that it's kind of it's falling between the cracks. So the critic worries about a desire for harm. So we're saying that's not essential.
Yeah.
And we're turning to disesteem, actions of various kinds.
Yeah.
But what I'm wondering about is what's happened to what it feels like to be angry.
Yeah.
Okay. And whether what role that plays. It doesn't appear in much of what you've been saying, right?
Mm.
And it may be that anger and resentment are different this way, and I don't know.
Yeah.
But it feels to me like that's kind of one of the things that might make the critic worry about the anger without having to assume the desire for harm. It's this strong, powerful feeling that typically goes with anger.
Yeah.
So I wonder where that fits in your picture.
Great. No, that's a really fair point. And the honest truth is that when I was editing this written text down to fit into a length that could be delivered, I edited out the bits where I talked about affect. But and maybe this reflects my not taking them sufficiently seriously. So the question is very well taken and very opportune. I obviously, anger has a distinctive affect. People are exercised. I did talk about this a little bit when I was characterizing it, though I didn't dwell on it very much. And it has a kind of preoccupying character that distinguishes it maybe from sorrow or sadness, which are, backup emotions that the enemies of anger think we might fall back on. To express our kind of investment in moral values once we've overcome our anger in some ways. I think the affect of anger makes it preoccupying. It's a hot emotion. It's kind of dominates our consciousness in a certain way, and I think this connects to the behavioral dispositions.
Well, it's all that I'm wondering about. That is,
Yeah.
suppose now we agree that when
Yeah.
we talk about anger, we really need to include that as a really important part
Yeah,
of anger. But
it is an important part.
But most of what you said doesn't really involve that. It's a negative esteem and standing up.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering, a certain kind of view might be, all that's really important to be clear about your negative esteem and to stand up. But cool it with the anger. It's self-destructive, it's socially destructive. That would be an analog of a critic who doesn't, without depending on its being a desire to inflict harm,
Right.
but it's a criticism of the affective side, which can be, as we know, quite powerful.
Yeah. Good. Well, I think there are two aspects of that affective side to consider. One is the effects of it on the subject of anger, right? It's kind of like a state that it's upsetting to be in some ways, right? And in the longer version of this text, that's the thing I dwelled on, the fact that someone else it doesn't just hold us in esteem, but is in a kind of agitated state of mind about the thing that they disapprove in us. I think going back to the sociability hypothesis, we don't want to be in a social world where people are themselves kind of upset in this preoccupying way about things we've done. The fact that it's unpleasant for them to be in the state with this affective profile, enhances our own vulnerability to the attitudes. And, when we're in the position of the target, makes us averse to that state in itself, independently of whether it's expressed. It's kind of, this is just a further aspect of our inherent sociability. We don't just care about whether other people hold us in a disesteem. We don't want other people to be like upset on our behalf insofar as that's a dysphoric state in itself. Now, I think the critics of anger are mostly worried about the negative effects of anger on the target of the anger rather than on the subject. That's why they kind of focus, if you think of Nussbaum or Owen Flanagan, or, they tend to focus on...
A scholarly comment about what I'm wondering whether or not, when we take seriously the affective side of anger, there's a grounds for worry about it as an emotion that's going to play such a central role in holding it accountable.
Yeah.
Which,
Well,
in your view, I take it
that's what I'm trying to affirm. Yeah, but I'm trying to affirm it in ways that, do some justice to these, multifarious traditions of hostility to anger in some ways, and try to kind of build that into the account in some ways. But the thing is, what is when you were talking about the affective aspect, you were saying it's kind of interpersonally dangerous in some sense, and that seems to be a matter of not just the affect, what the affect's like for the subject, but the effects of being in that affective state for other people.
I agree with that. So the question is whether or not you want an emotion with that characteristic to be at the bottom of your theory of holding accountable.
Yeah, I do.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I think that contributes. I do, as long as the affective component can be, this is where I was kind of trying to sanitize it, right? It can be detached from a disposition. There's sanitizing going on. This is called socialization, bringing people up, inducting them into a practice where their anger becomes something potentially constructive, but is still legible as anger, right? And I'm saying that the primary site for this, it doesn't involve overcoming the affect, because to overcome the affect, I think you're right, would be not to have anger in your repertoire any longer. That's essential to it. But to domesticate its behavioral expressions. And it's okay for me that it's a preoccupying, upsetting state, that as long as the dispositions are dispositions to confront and protest and demand that the infraction be dealt with in the context of a relationship that the subject still cares about. At least that's my story, and I'm going to stick with it for the time being. But
I want to push back on your claim that blame is directed obligations that are owed to other individuals. And I'm thinking, right, if I tell you, why didn't you stand up to your ex-partner, right? It doesn't seem to be that I am blaming you for something that you did something else. It's something you did to yourself. I can do the same thing. My teenage son, right, is taking a bunch of drugs, and I get real upset, and I blame them for all the self-harm that they're doing. Yeah. It seems to not be relational. I can also blame myself. Imagine that my teenager son dies, and I'm reacting to that, and I blame myself, maybe I didn't do enough, or maybe I killed a baby by accident, my own child by accident, and I blame myself. Yeah. So none of these seem to be directed at other individuals. They all seem to be internal. At least the obligation seems to be internal to the individual. So would you just remove them from the equation? Because they look very similar to the way the rest of blame. So how do you separate it?
Great. No, that's helpful. I mean, I'm going to, of course, see a relational element in each of the, I think you gave me 4 or 5 different examples. But let's start with the one where you tell your friend that they should really have, stood up to their partner or something. Is that the idea? Right. I mean, you wouldn't say that unless the partner had been wronging to them. You're not just going to tell them to stand up to the partner, if the partner's treating them completely, in a way that's beyond reproach, right? You're going to tell them to stand up to the partner if their partner has been taking advantage of them or abusing them or wronging them in some other way. And that's that's the kind of background context. I want to say in that kind of context, there's warrant for reactive blame as I'm understanding it, and that's where the relational element comes into it. Now I think you're absolutely right. Someone might have warrant for blame, but be too timid to stand up for themselves in that kind of context, not be willing to express it, even if they have some latent disposition to do so in the context. And I think the kind of thing you're imagining yourself saying to your friend makes perfect sense in that context. That actually dovetails with something I was saying at one point in this in these remarks, which is that the primary site of accountability relations is within the nexus between an agent and a party who's been wronged by the agent's behavior, whose claims and interests have not been shown sufficient consideration. In that context, reactive blame is a way of standing up for yourself, asserting claims on your own behalf, and I connected it to a conception of dignity. And I think when I imagine you're telling your friend you should stand up to your partner, you're focusing on that aspect in the story. You have claims here that have been flouted by your partner. They're taking advantage of you. They're and you know, you should you should stand up for yourself, which is precisely what reactive blame is doing on my story about it. Now, I'd have to say different things about the other accounts you've given in the context that involve your relationship to your son. I think obviously you have obligations to your child to look after their welfare and protect them from harm in some ways. And some of the examples you were giving me in those contexts, I think, would appeal to your own sense of having failed relative to those obligations you owe to your son, right?
So that'll be self-blame.
Yeah, that would be self-blame.
So it's not, you're not talking about the direct obligation that are owed to other individuals.
Well, in that case, yeah, you're blaming yourself. In some sense, your self-blame is what I am saying about these other cases. I'm not going to talk much about self-blame in these lectures, but I will tomorrow talk about indignation a fair bit. But I see both of these as kind of parasitic on the primary case, which is resentment. And so I do think on my kind of moralized story of guilt, what you're doing in some sense is blaming yourself on behalf of your son. You know, you're holding yourself to account. You're exercised by your own failure to show appropriate regard for the claims that your son had against you or your child had against you as their parent, to protect them from harm and look after their needs. And there's that element in the story.
So one last quick question, Laura.
Okay, I was interested in the contrast between blame and sort of aiming at repair versus the Scanlon view of blaming as exit.
Yeah.
I was wondering what you made of a fusion case where you sort of go confront someone to air your grievances with the ultimatum that there's no way to repair them, as happens in breakups and divorces.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, I at the end of the day, repair is complete only if the relationship can be restored on a basis of shared investment in the kind of norms that define the the obligations that the parties owe to each other. And I think I said at one point that it requires ultimately that the subject of blame should be able to overcome it and move beyond it, to offer forgiveness in some sense. And that's obviously not always possible. It really depends on the nature of the relationship. If the infraction was sufficiently grievous, and I think especially in a case where there's like an irreparable harm that was caused as a result of the original infraction, the victim of it might just not be interested in resuming normal interactions with the person on the basis of, especially in relationships that were originally based on a lot of trust and attachment and so on. They just might not be want to move on to relating to other people and not the original party any longer. Those cases are. I think it's just built into this trajectory that whether forgiveness itself is kind of discretionary, right? It can't be demanded as a matter of entitlement from the party who's been wronged, and whether the party who's been wronged is going to be willing to offer forgiveness at the end of the day or able to is a contingent matter. But I still think it's important that constructive blame be oriented to a process that at least initiates a pathway towards repair, even if repair can't happen at the end of the day for whatever reason. And again, I'll come back to this theme tomorrow in talking about some cases that can't even be taken up in the initial phases in a way that would open into a process of repair. But anyway.
With that, I think we need to thank our speaker.